Captain Picard's 4 Star Trek movie villains ranked worst to best. Captain Jean-Luc Picard, Patrick Stewart, faced 4 major league villains in Star Trek, The Next Generation's movies, and here they are ranked worst to best. Starting with 1994 as Star Trek Generations, directed by David Carson, the cast of Star Trek The Next Generation took over the Star Trek movie franchise. 3 more films followed: 1996 as Star Trek First Contact, and 1998 as Star Trek Insurrection, directed by Jonathan Frakes, and 2002 as Star Trek Nemesis, directed by Stuart Baird. Khan Noonien Singh, Ricardo Montalban, the eponymous villain of Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan, looms over the cinematic adversaries, Captain Picard, and the crew of the USS Enterprise D in the face. Khan is considered the ultimate Star Trek movie villain, even today. When Star Trek The Next Generation switched to feature films, they required larger-than-life heavies, and nearly all of Star Trek The Next Generation's movies tried to create their version of Khan. It's notable that the most successful TNG movie villain wasn't a Khan substitute, but an expansion of Star Trek The Next Generation's greatest foe. Adhar Ruafo was the leader of the Sunna, a nomadic race who were originally part of the Baku people. Ruafo partnered with Starfleet Admiral Doherty, Anthony Zierb, to take the metaphasic particles of the Briar Patch, a region of space which has regenerative effects akin to a fountain of youth. Ruafo and Doherty's plan would have rendered the planet Baku uninhabitable, so Starfleet planned to forcibly relocate the Baku people. Captain Picard and the USS Enterprise commit an insurrection against Starfleet to foil this plot and save the Baku. Despite his treachery, Ruafo doesn't project the necessary menace of a truly great Star Trek movie villain. Ruafo may be best known for his comical scream toward the end of Star Trek Insurrection. Ruafo and the Sunna were willing to commit genocide against the Baku, but they didn't pose much of a problem for Captain Picard and the USS Enterprise. Meanwhile, Admiral Doherty was the latest in a long line of evil Starfleet admirals, but he was betrayed and murdered by Ruafo. However, Academy Award winner F. Murray Abraham does what he can from beneath Ruafo's prosthetics to make his Star Trek Insurrection villain memorable. Dr. Tolian Saran goes down in Star Trek history as the villain responsible for killing Captain James T. Kirk, William Shatner. Like Guinan, Whoopi Goldberg, Saran was an El-Orien, a long-loved race of listeners. In the late 23rd century, Saran was released from the Nexus, an intergalactic energy ribbon that contained an alternate reality that was like being inside Joy. Enacting an 80-year scheme to re-enter the Nexus, Dr. Saran planned to destroy the Viridian Star to disrupt the Nexus path to the planet Viridian 3, where Saran would be waiting to return to paradise. An obvious attempt by Star Trek Generations to echo Khan's villainy, Dr. Tolian Saran was a relentless madman, although he wasn't seeking vengeance. Yet Saran was willing to kill millions just to return to the Nexus, and he partnered with the Klingon criminal sisters Lursa, Barbara Marsh, and B'Etor Gwynth Walsh to achieve his goal. It took the team-up of Captain Picard and Captain Kirk to stop Saran, at the cost of Kirk's life. Had the Mad Doctor killed Kirk by shooting him in the back, as in Star Trek Generations' original cut, it may have guaranteed Saran as the top Star Trek The Next Generation movie villain. Captain Jean-Luc Picard, one of the most iconic captains in Star Trek history, faced many challenges throughout his career, particularly in the 4 Star Trek films led by the Next Generation cast. These films presented memorable villains, each offering a unique threat to Picard and his crew. From the seductive schemes of the Borg Queen to the vengeful madness of Shinzen, these adversaries tested Picard's leadership and values. But not all villains are created equal. Here's a ranking of the 4 main antagonists in Picard's Star Trek films, from worst to best. 4. Ruafo, Star Trek Insurrection. Star Trek Insurrection introduced Ruafo, a member of the Sunna race, who serves as the film's main antagonist. The Sunna, driven by a need for power and revenge, seek to exploit the regenerative properties of a unique planet to rejuvenate their rapidly aging bodies. While Ruafo is undeniably menacing, his character is ultimately one of the weaker and less memorable villains in the Star Trek movie pantheon. Ruafo's motivations feel relatively thin, centering on a desire to regain his youth and settle an old score with the peaceful Baku people. While this could have been a profound exploration of vanity and resentment, it doesn't translate into the same kind of depth or complexity as other Star Trek villains. His obsession with youthful rejuvenation feels small-scale compared to the universe-altering stakes that are typical of Star Trek movies. Additionally, Ruafo's plan harvesting the planet's regenerative properties at the expense of its inhabitants lacks the moral complexity that defines other Picard villains. That said, actor F. Murray Abraham does his best to infuse Ruafo with a degree of menace. His performance is strong, but the character lacks the grandiosity or depth of a truly great villain. The film's more lighthearted tone also detracts from the sense of threat Ruafo poses, making him a somewhat forgettable antagonist. 3. Shinzen, Star Trek, Nemesis. In Star Trek, Nemesis, Picard faces a dark reflection of himself in the form of Shinzen, a human clone raised by Romulans to eventually replace him. Shinzen's backstory is compelling. Abandoned after a failed Romulan plot, he rises to power in the Romulan Empire, only to turn on his former masters. His bitterness toward Picard stems from the life he never had, a life filled with love, respect, and purpose. Shinzen's hatred for Picard and his desire to destroy Earth is fueled by his feelings of isolation and betrayal. Tom Hardy, in one of his early roles, plays Shinzen with a mix of vulnerability and menace, though the script doesn't always do his character justice. There's a fascinating potential in the idea of Picard facing his younger self, who has taken a far darker path, but this dynamic is underexplored in the film. While Shinzen's ultimate plan to destroy Earth with a deadly weapon raises the stakes, the personal nature of his vendetta against Picard isn't fully developed. What could have been a powerful, character-driven conflict instead becomes a somewhat generic revenge story. Still, the emotional core of Picard facing a twisted version of himself is engaging, even if the execution falls short of its potential. 2. Dr. Saran, Star Trek, Generations. Dr. Saran, played by Malcolm McDowell, is the villain of Star Trek, Generations, the film that bridges the original series and the next generation. Saran is a brilliant but disturbed scientist who will stop at nothing to return to the Nexus, a rift in space-time where one can experience eternal bliss. His motivation stems from a deep personal tragedy, having once been in the Nexus. Saran is desperate to return to that paradise, even if it means destroying entire planets to alter the course of a star. Saran's villainy is particularly effective because it plays on a deeply human emotion, grief. His actions, while horrific, are driven by an understandable desire to escape the pain of loss. This makes him a more relatable villain than some of the more outlandish foes Picard has faced. McDowell brings an icy intensity to the role, portraying Saran as a man who has nothing left to lose and no moral compass left to guide him. What makes Saran stand out is his philosophical conflict with Picard. Where Picard values duty, sacrifice, and responsibility, Saran represents the temptation to abandon all of that for personal happiness. Their climactic confrontation not only involves action, but also a battle of ideals, making Saran one of the more thought-provoking villains in Star Trek. 1. The Borg Queen, Star Trek First Contact. Without question, the best villain Picard faces in the Star Trek films is the Borg Queen from Star Trek First Contact. The Borg, a terrifying collective that assimilates entire civilizations, have been one of the most iconic enemies in Star Trek lore. In First Contact, the Borg Queen is introduced as the personification of the collective's hive mind, adding a chilling new layer to the already fearsome Borg.